army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to episode 76 of Chasing Ghost in Irregular Warfare podcast. The title of this episode is Modern Antifa, Communist Insurgency in the U.S. Part 5, Conclusions. So one thing that I wanted to tackle during this was a brief synopsis of what we've spoken to before in the previous 4 episodes, and then also to offer some solution sets. Some tepid, most scorched earth. So if you have delicate sensibilities and maybe even an allergy to solving civilizational problems, you may want to turn off this episode right now. Between the 76 episodes that I have here at Chasing Ghosts and the 19 episodes I have over at War Notes, my occasional conflict podcast, where I speak to things that aren't quite irregular warfare, we are 5 shy of 100 when I started this a little bit over 3 years ago. So I wanted to thank all of my current listeners. If you're a new listener, welcome aboard. I'm so happy to have you. I have a Substack. At that Substack, one of the primary reasons why I built that was not only to host Chasing Ghost and War Notes and my occasional scribbling and such, but also to have a comment function there where I could interact in hopefully deep conversations outside of the haiku of my presence on X or newly back at Gab, where I am at Lysander6 for the podcast there. So if you happen to be on Gab, please follow me. If you happen to be on Twitter, please follow me. If you need to get in touch with me, you can email me at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. And my Chasing Ghost Substack is there. And I would love to interact with my listeners. Now, by the way, I don't have hat in hand. I do have paid subscribers. I have 47 of them there. And I wanted to do a shout out and say I am so honored and grateful for your support. Helps me buy books and electronic and technical equipment to constantly try to battle the technological fatigue I feel because I am not a cyber ninja, and keeping the sound on this as state-of-the-art as possible. So, again, thanks for supporting Chasing Ghosts. Now, not to sound alarmist, but to actually be alarmist, I think we are here in this first quarter century, which we are going to be passing up with January 1st and entering the second quarter century of this new millennium, believe it or not. We are at a civilizational crossroads at which we have a choice. We can either embrace the central planning government supremacist mindset that will turn all of the things that we have gained over the last 2 millennia, and of course, thanks to the introduction of coffee, silent reading, and atomized book publishing, after the 16th century in Europe on that peculiar continent, we had the Enlightenment and, as John Cleese would say, the Renaissance, and all the other wonderful scientific engineering and technological achievements that have been gifted and bestowed upon humanity as a result of Christendom's occupation of said part of the earth and Europe, and everything that we reap as a reward for that. Living in this time, in this snapshot in history, as the wealthiest, most affluent, and relatively free people that have ever breathed air as human beings on this planet since formal human civilization emerged millennia ago. The crossroads at which we're at is, do we embrace free markets, free speech, relatively atomized and unfettered and unmolested human action transactions by their billions? Or do we submit ourselves to all of these communard Marxoid experiments? Remember, I use this umbrella rubric of government supremacist, which is employed as a linguistic symbology, as it were, for communism, socialism, national socialism, leftism, liberalism, all of these that embrace the idea of a large monolithic state at the top with a relative monopoly on violence, dictating through central planning, of course, which never works, how these atomistic human beings behave on a daily basis. Let's step back to the 19th century very quickly so that I can paint for you a picture of why we're where we're at. By the first decade of the 19th century, I have often spoke in the past in passing of one William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament in the UK at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and I look at him probably as patient zero, as the single benefactor we can all look back to and thank, who asked, and he was laughed at by both sides of the aisle in the British Parliament, is it moral to own other human beings? Is chattel slavery correct, regardless of the color of their skin? Because, of course, in the West, one is obsessed with African slaves crossing the Atlantic, not so obsessed with African slaves going into the Muslim empires in the East, nor the millions of white European slaves who were taken into the Muslim enclaves in the East. The question he posed to both sides of the Parliament was that it is, well, I guess a statement on his part, it is immoral to possess other human beings as property. And, of course, we all know from our history of the 19th century, and I've mentioned this in passing, it was the English and the Royal Navy that started this anti-chattel slavery crusade, stopping the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean in this case, doing their best on naval patrols, stopping Muslim slave traders and raiders on the other side, but concentrating most of their efforts in the Atlantic. I've mentioned that between 1510 and 1875, according to the receipts that one can find at slavevoyages.org, you will discover that of the almost 12.5 million slaves that crossed the Atlantic during that period of time, those that landed on the Atlantic coast of what would become America, Canada was so insignificant, I think that there were 6,000 plus slaves in total over that entire period of time that ended up landing there, whether that was in the French or British provinces of Canada at the time. But of that amount, approximately 340,000 out of those 12 plus million landed on the Atlantic seaboard in the Atlantic slave trade. The lion's share of the remainder went to the Caribbean, Brazil, and other environs. Now, why would I bring this up in the concluding episode of Modern Antifa, where I'm discussing what I see as a communist insurgency in the U.S.? It is for this simple observation on my part. I just described to you what William Wilberforce said in train in England in the 19th century. Now, we have a particularly odious character entering the world stage who has a much greater impact on the world stage in the 20th century when all of his horrible and absolutely economically illiterate garbage is taken as a signal and a call to arms in the 20th century. And of course, this would be Karl Marx. Here is my suggestion. Karl Marx arrived when chattel slavery, that would be the ownership of human beings and whomever they may have had as a result of families, who would also become the property of the slave owners. Marx came along and That chattel slavery brand was it was starting to reek. It was starting to not only insult moral sensibilities, but folks were coming to the conclusions that, well, primary extractive resources and the employment thereof of hands and strong backs and such to extract cotton, mining, whatever the case may be, were one thing, but to take said extracted resources and then all of a sudden turn them into something that either sells on the market, powers civilization, builds ships, or whatever the case may be, usually requires a kind of labor that is far more sophisticated than taking stuff out of the ground, off of vegetation, and putting it into wagons or whatever transportation modalities there may be, bringing them to a factory, and in said factory, turning these into the miraculous products that we saw in the 19th century as a result of the Industrial Revolution. So because of this, chattel slavery was on the ropes. It was not an institution. By the way, the institution of slavery before the 19th century was the way of Earth, was the way of the planet, was the way of human civilization for thousands of years, going back all the way to the beginning of agricultural and cityscape development and things like that in humankind, going back to thousands of years. The Roman Empire, probably one of the most powerful militaries prior to the 15th century, was powered by slaves. The Byzantine Empire was powered by slaves. Empires up until this peculiar point in the 19th century were powered, for the most part, by slavery in one form or another. My suggestion is that Karl Marx came along with the Communist Manifesto and in his collaboration with Engels, Friedrich Engels, wrote a number of books, which I don't recommend to anybody, that merely suggested the rudiments of central planning, maximum state, Leviathan violence, and all kinds of things that would be levied upon all the atomistic and smaller aspects of human communities, whether those are individuals, families, villages, towns, cities, and construct what would later be known in the Russian patois as nomenclaturas, which would be the leading classes within these allegedly classless societies and Marxoid infrastructures that would inform the communist state towards the end of the 19th century and really coming into its vivid, violent, and tangible forms in the 20th century around the globe, especially accelerating after the conclusion of World War II in 1945, where all of a sudden, in concert with the shedding of colonial empires from the Europeans for the most part, came the ascendancy of the communist ideal, not only in its institutionalized instantiation in the USSR, in China, in smaller places like Vietnam and Cuba and places like that, but it would also invade the West as an idea. So my conclusion is rather simple. Marxism, communism, and by extension, some of the more gently received rubrics like socialism. Socialism is where one hides the communist gun instead of brandishing it. It comes out later on, though. It always does. Communism is rebranded and upgraded chattel slavery. It is putting people on plantations in a fashion through indoctrination where the slaves, in this case, beg to be put on the plantation and beg for slave masters. So I wanted to put that up front so that I could be quite frank in why I am personally affronted and alarmed by communism and all of its government supremacist variations planet-wide, and why I am sounding the alarm, as it were, here in the United States in what I perceive to be a communist insurgency. In this case, it would be Antifa, which we have spent, for those who are just listening to this episode and haven't listened to the previous ones, I just spent the previous 4 episodes examining, for the most part, the 20th century roots and specifics of how this came about in America to be here at the, as I mentioned before, the second quarter of the 21st century, and why we are facing this down and why we need to do something about it. I am going to make an assumption here, and I'm going to make the assumption that if you're a listener, and even if you don't quite believe my entire case, suspend one's disbelief and follow me in what I would recommend would be some of the things to ameliorate this threat, to counter this threat, to, if we can, destroy this toxic virus that has been imported into the United States, much like what the Germans did to the Russian body politic in 1917, when they took Lenin and his confreres, put them on an armored train, and drove them into Russia like one would inject a lethal virus into a body to either kill it or, in the case of the Soviet Union, turn it into an ambulatory zombie for over 70 years. By the way, what I'd like to do here is a short pause for a call to action. I am in the September, October of my years, and I simply don't have the means to pursue what I think would be a way for someone to really make their academic bones, and that's this. I discovered that from the 1940s until I think it was 1971, the House Un-American Affairs Committee was in force in the Congress, and that at the National Archives, there are literally boatloads of documentation from what they did over those decades. And I suspect, hat tip to Harvey Clare, K-L-E-H-R, who may have dabbled a bit, and I consider him to be one of the better anti-communist scribes out there who describe the history of that time. I think that if you're an academic, whether you are entombed in an American university or a freelance academic, sort of like myself, an amateur academic and historian, uncredentialed to the hilt, if you were to take the time, take a year off, get some sponsorship or whatever the case may be, to pursue this very thing and dig out and find out what did they find out about communist activity in America. As I described earlier in the other episodes, this started to really take shape in the 1920s and especially accelerating in the 1930s, where all of a sudden the Communist Party of the USA, the CPUSA, even holds a massive convention, 1938, 1939 in Chicago, in which they have this 3-story high visage of Abraham Lincoln, who was a correspondent with Marx. Now, that correspondence with Marx, was that Marx writing to Lincoln? Was that Lincoln writing to Marx? I think it was more so Marx writing to Lincoln because he so admired what he was doing during the American Civil War. That is a story for another day. So my ask, my suggestion, my call is that if you happen to be one of those aforementioned intellectuals or scholars out there who's really interested in making your bones in a place that I think has not had the revelation that it should, those pallets of documents that are probably there at the archive are waiting to be discovered, absorbed, researched, footnoted, cited, and everything else. Books, podcasts. Heck, I think when I look at this just superfluously, I think a person could spend their entire lives examining these archives because I don't think the revelations have seen the light of day. End of ask. In the 1940s, there was something called the Smith Act, the Alien Registration Act. It was a U.S. law making it illegal to advocate for the violent overthrow of the government, print material advocating such, or organize groups promoting it, also requiring non-citizens to register and be fingerprinted. Passed amidst World War II fears that targeted subversives, notably communists, leading to high-profile trials. We haven't covered that in any of these, and maybe that is fodder for the future. Dennis v. United States would be one of those, and there was Brandenburg v. Ohio later on in 1969. Now, in Dennis v. U.S., it upheld convictions of Communist Party leaders, establishing a clear and present danger test for sedition. I'm wondering if that clear and present danger quote comes from that case itself. Yates v. U.S., 1957, distinguished between abstract advocacy, legal, and advocating for concrete action, illegal. And the one I mentioned, Brandenburg, it set a stricter standard requiring speech to be intended to incite imminent lawless action. Now, one can fast forward to the contemporaneous period that we're living in now with illegal immigration and the behavior of ICE on the streets. And of course, you can see where some of this may be germane. I don't know whether it's been applied or not. Then there was something in the 1950s. It was the Internal Security Act of 1950, also known as the McCarran Act. Yes, that same McCarran for which the Las Vegas airport is named. It was a U.S. law passed during the Cold War's Red Scare, requiring communist groups to register with the government, banning them from defense jobs, and allowing for detention of suspected subversives despite President Truman's veto. It created the Subversive Activities Control Board and included controversial provisions for detention during national emergencies, sparking debate between security and civil liberties, with parts later overturned and repealed. Again, the plea that I had out there for a budding scholar to dig into the archives for the House Un-American Affairs Committee, you could do the same thing with the Subversive Activities Control Board and a lot of these other things that I'm talking about here. For instance, one of the key provisions was restrictions on communists, barred known communists from federal employment, denied passports, and made it a crime to work towards a totalitarian dictatorship in the U.S. But by 1999, for those of my audience who have held a security clearance, your Communist Party affiliation was removed from the questioning portions of said security clearance paperwork. As I have said, as a very quick aside, one of the reasons why the current Democratic Party, which has always been the public face of the intelligence community in the United States, one of the reasons why I think they have such a hard case against the Russians is because the Russians from 1989 to 1991 gave up on the communist project in the USSR and freed themselves from the burden of that kind of comprehensive central planning and the slave plantation that was communism. I'd mentioned before the Communist Control Act of 1954, the CCA, was a U.S. law signed by President Eisenhower that aimed to outlaw the Communist Party USA by declaring it an instrument of a conspiracy to overthrow the government, removing its legal rights, and criminalizing membership or support for it through provisions that have since been repealed, technically leaving the party illegal but rarely enforced. Notes Wisconsin Watch. It built on that 1950 McCarran Act that I just mentioned, allowing juries to consider actions like financial contributions or following orders as evidence of membership. Key provisions were they outlawed the party, there were membership penalties if it was discovered, labor unions were not permitted to employ communists, it complemented that McCarran Act, and of course, we all know, and this is fodder for a future episode, whether I do it or someone else does, Daryl Cooper at Martyr Made, one of my favorite podcasts of all time. I'm looking at you. You could do a multi-part series on the Communist Party in the United States from the 1930s to present, and it would be a ripping good yarn, especially given your unique research talents and your ability to really make those kind of what appears to be disparate connections, but nonetheless are root cause and proximate cause connections to give us a much better picture of just how dire this communist threat was to the United States. And later on, seeing that there were certain aspects of certain political parties in the United States that took the whole cloth of the communist project and made it part of the fabric of everything that they do. So I needn't bother you with the communist roots and DNA that is a peculiar part of the Antifa movement in Europe and the Antifa movement in the United States. I mean, one need not go any further than seeing photos and videos of the usual suspects at these and the kind of flags that they wave, the hammer and sickle, their associations with the Democratic Socialists of America, with the Communist Party USA, and all of its variants. There's the older Communist Party USA, which was founded in 1919. There's the American Communist Party, the ACP, founded in 2024. There are other organizations out there like the Revolutionary Communist Party USA, the Workers' World Party that was founded in 1959, the Party for Socialism and Liberation founded in 2004, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, New African Black Panther Party, the Progressive Labor Party. It goes on and on. If you were to go to Europe, where in France and Italy, for instance, communist parties have been part of their electoral framework since the end of World War II on a formal basis, and other countries there, one can look at the United Kingdom now, and when you look at the Labour Party and other such, you find that there doesn't have to be a communist party because the Labour Party in Great Britain is carrying the water for what the communist objectives are. And communist objectives really are rather simple when you take away all the flowery rhetoric and the red rags and the bad music and such, because what you discover is it means a maximum state that will take every aspect of atomistic human behavior, action, and transactions and put them in the hands of the state to be regulated. That's what it really comes down to, no matter how one tries to parse it or dress that pig as something that it isn't. Now, I just so happen to be a free speech absolutist, but what one sees here is that if you use the university campuses, and I talked about that in the previous episode, so I won't burden you with it here, we all know that those university campuses, one could even say K through PhD, have been hijacked, suborned, and are wholly owned subsidiaries of the small c communist effort to change the fabric of the American polity and American civilization to almost mimic the failures of 20th century communism and socialism planet-wide, but with a new and updated imprimatur with technology and such that we now have in the 21st century, in which these folks who think that they are so much better at running our lives than we are as individuals, they've come up with a variety of means to do so. Some people would laughably say that the environmental movement is a watermelon where it is green on the outside and red on the inside. I have to say that I consider most of those who are climate change protesters, activists, and folks who are convinced that anthropogenic global warming, man's impact on weather, is so significant that the only answer is to change the way industrial civilization operates. I'm fond of thinking that if it's global warming, the answer is always communism. If it's global cooling, which seems to be the fashionable split that's occurring right now, the answer inevitably will be communism. Because they use these kind of things, whether it is poverty, climate, the difference in wealth between folks who live within the borders of a given nation as being the reasons why the government has to take over everything. And with the enlightened and ever so altruistic individuals who are communist, socialist, and let's use that rubric term, government supremacists, they will do such a greater job of organizing and making mankind not only friendlier to the planet, but friendlier to each other. Tens of millions, one could say hundreds of millions of corpses in the 20th century alone are a testament to why this is wrong thinking, wrong think, and anti-civilization, and I would suggest barbarism. Industrial scale barbarism. Industrial scale murder. Industrial scale starvation. But here we are. So if my anti-communist bona fides aren't evident by now, you haven't been listening, have you? As you know, I'm classifying this as a communist insurgency. And as you also know, if you've had the pleasure of listening to all 75 of the previous episodes, you know that I am a severe critic and skeptic of Western counterinsurgency and its ability to be successful. And I think that I've demonstrated with aplomb that counterinsurgency, for the most part, doesn't work. So I'm going to suggest that there are no military solutions with this one proviso. Everyone is aware that I have rang the bell repeatedly on Islamist terrorist cells being present and being here among us in the United States, and that it's a matter of when and not if that one morning we're all going to wake up to an ongoing tragedy and cavalcade of calamities that are going to alarm us in a way that will exceed the alarm we all experienced on that fated day in September 2001, September 11th, when all of a sudden America went to war again. Stay strapped, stay armed, get trained, make it a lifestyle of carrying a firearm wherever you go, whether it's to protect yourself against that threat, the Islamist cells or whatever terror cells may be in America, to either do a localized attack or a coordinated United States-wide CONUS attack. Well, it could probably also be Hawaii and Alaska when that occurs. But nonetheless, it is up to you to protect yourself. And I've covered that in my Storming America series, I think especially the last 2 episodes where I talked about taking it down from the larger context to the more familial and friendship context of what you can do atomistically to help yourself as far as protection is concerned. So I can't offer a military solution because that tends not to work. What can work against insurgencies, and we've touched on this before in the 75 previous episodes in this podcast, is good old sophisticated and diligent and boring and detailed detective work, gumshoe work, putting together the tedious association matrices that you would find either local, county, state, or federal police doing to do RICO or wholesale organized crime investigations and things like that. I will post the link again to How They Hunt by Lizard Farmer, where he describes how the federal government goes after an individual, a person of interest that they're interested in, by using phone tags, social media, license plates, vehicle registration, property ownership, all of these kind of things. If one wanted to determine who had membership, who was active, who was deputized into, who may have even been a cutout for the various small c communist organizations that I just mentioned, to include lone wolves who happen to have the same government supremacist aspirations of these Communist Party organizations. Antifa was a Communist Party in Germany. It was a communist party in all of its manifestations and permutations around the world, mostly in the Western world, during that entire time from the 1930s until today. And if the FBI could find in itself the capability to put together a task force, maybe the task force already exists, where it conducts a huge forensic analysis of who did what, who was where, who the members are, what one could put on a whiteboard. In this case, it would probably be dozens or hundreds of whiteboards, much like you've seen when you've watched television shows or movies that have detailed law enforcement going after the mafia. They decomposed the organizations. They developed parent and child relationships. This is anything from you can examine how an engine works by taking apart its constituent parts, or how people are associated with each other. Because we all know that when it comes to mass movements, as it were, and this is accepting lone wolf behavior, that there are going to be contacts and communications between various members that are either going to go vertical or horizontal. In this case, vertical would be who's at the head. Horizontal would be the cellular structures. By the way, I talked about cellular structures in another episode that I did where we went into that in tedious and excruciating detail on how terror and military cells work. The U.S. government and all of its tentacled networks among law enforcement, there are 19,000 police departments in the United States. So from the local to the county to the state to the federal level, to include fusion centers and places like that. There are a variety of surveillance organizations and also forensic details from literally tens or hundreds of thousands of investigations that have already taken place, in which one can put all these parts and pieces and components together and come up with a really good idea of how this small c communist organization, we could even make it a micro-examination of Antifa as a discrete variant of the small c communist organizations in the United States. They could whiteboard cell phone tracking, ALPR, the automated license plate recognition data that's out there, property data, driver's license ID data, passports, all of these things. And what one would do is put these together, and you would go to a protest, for instance. And in all of these protests, as has been delineated in the past, especially with the work of Andy No and others, that's NGO, if you want to look up his fabulous book that he's got written on Amazon, which I urge you to get a copy of. So when you take all these linkages of property, one can also start putting names to the property, to the phone numbers, because as we all know, there's a lot of young people involved in this current communist movement, in this current Antifa movement, and they cannot live without their phones. Whether that is a matter of how they grew up as digital natives or their lack of discipline or both, one doesn't know, but nonetheless, it's a weakness that could be leveraged. What you'll also find is that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the RICO statutes, the racketeering and organized crime statutes that are out there, could also be employed. And what those do once a declaration is made for RICO or when FinCEN gets involved, then more law enforcement, investigation, and forensic tools can be used that couldn't be used in smaller crimes that are being committed. Now, the other thing is, once a declaration of international terrorist connections is made, then there is a whole host of investigation and forensic tools that are available for law enforcement that would make it quite a bit easier, not less tedious, but easier for them to find out. What has to be done here is what should have been done September 11th, 2001, what should have actually been done September 12th, 2001, where the current administration in charge, they took a knee, drank water, took a breath and said, we are going to forensically examine all of the folks who were responsible for this. We're going to find out who the players were, who the triggermen were, who the bomb men were, who was involved, who facilitated this in the United States and abroad, who financed it, who provided the auxiliary cutouts, who provided the safe houses. And we're going to put together that whiteboard or whiteboards that I just described to put names, faces, locations, and data to who did this and round them up. The same thing could be done now. If the United States were really serious about this communist insurgency, no military means would have to be applied in order to destroy it. Now, part of this is also color revolution activity. Unfortunately, what color revolution activity does, and I've covered this in previous episodes, is it involves intelligence agencies and the intelligence community in the United States and the West. And because they are able to hide behind so many layers of government-imposed secrecy and protocols not to reveal sources and such, this is a color revolution activity. And by implication and inference, one can say, as I have made the case for previously when I spoke of cartels, whether drug and or human trafficking cartels, in order for them to prosper in North America, especially in the United States, they have to own or have suborned law enforcement agents, agencies, and personnel. I am certain that that has happened at the top investigatory agencies at the states, especially if one concentrates in the Northeast or the West Coast, and at the federal government level, in the FBI and such, where pursuing these things that I just talked about, where you forensically examine, decompose, and discover who the people are with all the data necessary and what their connections are in Antifa and communist activities in the United States, and then you take the appropriate action. I don't know if this administration or the previous administration or any administration since the 1950s would be serious about pursuing this. All I am offering here is the suggestion that from the federal to the local level and everything in between, all of the tools, all of the forensics diagnostic equipment, all of the things needed to identify the members, players, and funders, especially if there is an internationalization of the investigation of this small c communist insurgency in the United States, is employed. This thing can be sussed out and discovered and taken care of in 12 to 24 months if the will is there politically to do so. I think this is critical for several reasons, as evidenced in the 2020 BLM riots and such, which also have these Antifa and communist connections, and all of the vandalism, the protests, the violence, the street crime, the incidents that are occurring on the West Coast. Portland and San Francisco are almost uninhabitable in certain parts of it. There are no-go zones in parts of major cities in the United States. All of this, for the most part, is a result of a complacency against this communist insurgency. Now, of course, is there crime out there that is completely unrelated to this? Of course there is. The violence, the property crime, carjackings, whatever the case may be. One could say that certainly probably 90% of that atomistic crime is not related to this. But nonetheless, crime is part of what this communist insurgency participates in by definition, because they are opposed to a non-communist form of governance. Hence, they do this to agitate for a larger and more leviathan and intrusive government, despite their protestations to the opposite when you see them calmly talking about their death cult to avid and sympathetic reporters on the news. My concerns are also that while there may not be a marriage between the Islamists and the communists, if said Islamist cells were to rise up, as I have talked about, I am convinced they will get spontaneous assistance from communist organizations, small c, in the United States, whether that is safe houses clogging up emergency 911 lines, providing them and provisioning them with the stuff that they need, whether it is political cover, groceries, or whatever they need to support their combatant activities. I have no doubt that that will occur if this rising, which I dread and think is more of a when, not an if, occurs in the homeland. Now, there are other components to dismantling this communist insurgency in the United States, less a military confrontation. Another thing you have to do is take the National Lawyers Guild and other associated organizations, Marxoid and left-wing organizations like it, that were simply designed, like the later permutations of the American Criminal Liberties Union, to provide a buttress and a face to defense of these kind of activities in the United States. It was founded in 1937, which arguably is the height of the Communist Party USA's political influence in the United States. And even according to historian Harvey Clare, one of my favorite 20th century American communism scholars out there, the NLG was allied with the Communist Party. In the 1930s, a significant number of NLG founders had been members or fellow travelers of the CPUSA, including Reimer and Joseph Brodsky of the Communist Party's International Labor Defense Auxiliary. During the McCarthy era, the NLG, that National Lawyers Guild, was accused by Attorney General Herbert Brownell Jr., as well as the House Un-American Activities Committee, of being a communist front organization. I have no doubt it was then. I have no doubt it is now a small c communist organization. It and other associated organizations like it, like the Legal Aid Foundations and things like that, along with all the other discoveries that we found about cutout organizations, like what the U.S. Agency for International Development and Intelligence Community cut out to avoid presidential findings and such, was financing all kinds of covert, clandestine, and color revolution action overseas. It turns out most likely, future historians will probably be able to suss this out, that those very color revolution activities that took place overseas have been practiced at home, at least for this century, if not a significant part of the 20th century. Remember what I've always said, that whatever empires do abroad, and America certainly is an empire, whether you acknowledge that or not, it always comes home. The United Kingdom is the greatest contemporary example, where I would suggest that with Keir Starmer and the rest of the Terminal Fabians, which started at the beginning of the 20th century in the UK, have achieved almost a singularity, almost a critical mass in driving the UK to its third world status that it is presently. So in league with the investigation and forensic suggestions that I made earlier, this is something that also has to be a front burner issue to take care of this, so that when protesters and small c communist and Antifa organizers and their fodder are gathered, whether they're committing violence against law enforcement or individual citizens or vandalism or violent protests, whatever the case may be, that the moment they find themselves in cuffs and arrested, that they don't avoid conviction simply because there is this sophisticated and very well-funded leftist organization or organizations out there who are helping them once they arrive at the police department. So I have a variety of solutions, but I try to stay within the 1 hour tolerance of my listeners with each one of these episodes. So I'm going to take the time now to tell you what I think is the most controversial solution set that I have to this. And this is rather scorched earth. And I think it does two things at once. I think it slays two birds with one stone, as it were. I consider the American education system with government subsidy since the 20th century. It's been in place since the 19th century, but really accelerated in the 20th century to first and foremost probably be the most responsible, along with social media, vehicle for the instupidation, the absolute leveling out of cognition, destruction of cognition, the smooth braining of generations of youth who just are robbed of their critical thinking skills, are slaves to endorphin rushes, and are folks who, for the most part, have been robbed of what I consider one of the greatest treasures of my childhood and adulthood, which is the reading of books, the critical reading of books, the active reading of books, the discussion of said books with other people who may have read them, the comprehensivist approach to research, which is where you read a minimum of 3 to 5 books, and what Mortimer Adler, in his brilliant book, How to Read a Book, considered the syntopical way of reading, which is one gathers from a variety of perspectives and authors on the same subject, so that if one is an active reader, you will discover just how the world works in that particular milieu and the single most accurate picture of what that looks like in reality. These last two generations have been robbed of that in large part because of the internet, because of social media, and because of the government school system from K through PhD. Now, I happen to think that a very large part of the mugshots of the snow cone hair tattooed and pierced nincompoops that we see so often in the media portrayed, whether in a montage or singly, I would suggest to you, and this is anecdotal, and if somebody can correct me on my assignation, I am happy to listen, that more than 90% of these small c communist insurgents and Antifa and its affiliates have either attended college or are graduates of college, most likely with non-STEM degrees, most likely with studies degrees. So I am offering a very radical way to, in the intermediate and long term, stop this communist insurgency. This will not be the single way. This will be one of the ways. But I would suggest to you that it is one of the primary reasons why we are in the boat that we're in the U.S. and by extension the West now. It is what happens in college indoctrination centers, in universities, in these Marxist madrasas, especially in the non-STEM areas. Now, I happen to have a day job in STEM, and the STEM employees that we are getting who are in their 20s and 30s, I am starting to see the manifestations of the woke-topian nonsense that has immiserated them to the point where they have trouble thinking. They have trouble with critical thinking. They have trouble with initiating new ways to look at things prismatically. They have trouble showing up on time. They have trouble with being told to do things that they may not want to do. Frankly, they have trouble with discipline because, as Jocko Willenick would tell us, discipline is freedom, and I believe that is certainly the case. So a radical surgery has to occur here. And here's where I may be offering solution sets that some may say are unattainable. We need to stop all student loans. We need to stop the federal subsidy of student loans. We need to make all student loans, if there is a forgiveness program, only forgiven by the institutions from whence they attended, especially with the Ivy Leagues, and that those who would satisfy those loan obligations, if the original people who signed those contracts for the loans don't, would be the universities and not the taxpayer. We need to stop all federal subsidy to K through PhD. It is all damaging, from kindergarten to the postgraduate degrees that I just described. When one looks at the early literature for the communist agitators in the first half of the 20th century, most of them are university students. The university is the orchid house. It is the natural seedbed for this kind of communist belief system and agitation, because it exists in a red ruby slipper clacking social milieu where everything is provided for it artificially, and it doesn't know where money comes from. It doesn't know how it's developed. It doesn't know how industry works. It doesn't know how business works, because it exists in this gas bubble of non-STEM and Marxoid thinking. It's a ghastly hybrid cocktail that thinks that it can take this university milieu that is entirely subsidized off the backs of taxpayers and the unborn with debt to develop these worldviews that are totally convoluted and not based in any reality whatsoever, but wishful thinking and what Friedrich Hayek would call the fatal conceit. These intellectuals, these people who allegedly have high IQs, thinking that since they're so much smarter than the rest of us, they know how to run our lives better than the rest of us. Now, of course, this informs itself not only in the professoriate, not only in the teaching assistants, not only in the up-and-coming graduate students who are going to assume the mantle of those retiring out of these PhD festivals in the universities, but it morphs itself into a communist, government supremacist, national socialist wish-casting factory in which it wishes to impose all of its odious death cult thoughts on the rest of humanity in the real world, and it doesn't work. So I suggest not only the elimination of all government subsidy, I said federal subsidy, but if we can convince the states and the localities to do the very same thing, K through 12, and even those who sponsor university systems within their respective states. But we also have to make it so that every time there is a small c communist agitator, Antifa, or affiliated organization that does these kind of things, once they are arrested, and possibly whether they are arrested and or convicted, all their student loans are called in immediately. This would send a signal out to the masked multitudes at these protests that if they get cuffed and potentially convicted, and the decision has to be taken on whether we do this when they're cuffed or when they're convicted, all their student loans are due immediately. I think that this kind of headbutting of reality to these communards and Marxoid lunatics would send a message through their ranks that not only would they possibly be facing jail time and fines, but the very thing that put them in the protest lines in the first place may cost them dearly. And I'm going to conclude with this now that we're on my Jeremiad against the universities. And I may have mentioned this before in episodes, but I think it is so germane now. I'm looking at you, Mr. Musk. I'm looking at you, 2,900 billionaires in the United States proper. I'm looking at all of you wealthy tech bros that are out there. There is a crisis here. You will recall that there was a president of Harvard who was accused of plagiarism, later on proved said plagiarism. Gay stepped down from her university presidency. I suspect she's still retaining her very lucrative salary even after stepping down, since she is a member of the woke nomenclatura in the university system. So here's my ask. I would love, of the 25 to 30,000 academic journals, I think those are in the Western world, whether STEM or non-STEM, most of those are non-STEM, develop an AI crawler and staff it with human beings who know what they're looking at when alarms can be set off in said crawler that looks for plagiarism, that looks for citations that don't quite match up to the footnotes that are cited. Look at the footnotes. Look where those footnotes are. Look who's citing who. Look at the reproducibility. Look at the retractions that are occurring in the academic community. What I want you to uncover, and this is even more so in STEM because it is so critically important to find it, because I am an engineer by trade, and we are the ones who demonstrably, when we do the wrong thing scientifically or engineering-wise, the world sees it by witness. When it comes to abstract science, maybe astronomy and things like that, it tends to be much more hidden. My supposition is this. There is a vast tapestry of academic malpractice, negligence, miscitation, plagiarism, and just plain nonsensical conclusions that aren't vetted, aren't seen, and are very, very nicely remunerated through grants, mostly, and some loans off of taxpayers' backs and those who are unborn with the debt that they will be paying off to pay for the stuff that is, for the most part, and I'm going to say this anecdotally, that 90% plus of all non-STEM journals out there, I'm looking at you electronic journals especially, because those are the ones the AI crawlers can examine in detail, don't provide any marginal utility nor advantage to humanity at large. Stop it, get rid of them, shut down their publishing houses. So there are my recommendations for facing down, maybe reducing or even ameliorating the small c communist insurgency like Antifa and its affiliates in the United States. Thanks for listening. I look forward especially to comments at my Substack, where you will come in and either correct me on minutia that I said or offer some kind of expansion to my comments on other means that we can use to ameliorate and eliminate this insurgency in the United States. If you wish to get in touch with me, go to my Substack, my Chasing Ghosts Substack. You can find it if you Googleoid it. You can write me at my email, which is cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. I thank you for all of my correspondents who have been gracious enough to write to me. And if you find that for some reason I have not responded to you, get back to me and slam me in the side of the head, and I will make it so. I'm on Twitter at WBupert. I am on Gab, just joined again because of some of the odious conduct when it comes to censorship at Twitter. I'm on Gab at Lysander6. So love to hear from you. If you are a new listener, welcome aboard. If you are a perennial listener, thank you so much for your support. Please pass on to family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances if you think they'd be interested in listening to this podcast. Again, thanks for listening. This is Bill, out.